Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, a European Chamber podcast that shares on-the-ground insights from European business leaders and experts on doing business in China. I'm your host, Gao Rui. 2024 has been an extraordinary year of elections. Two of the world's largest economies, the European Union and the United States, voted for their new leadership. Due to the strong economic ties between China, the EU, and the US, the ramifications of both elections could be enormous for European companies operating in China. In this episode, we'll focus on the results of the EU elections and its policy direction in relation to China, and also touch on the implications of Donald Trump's second term as the US president. I will be joined by Stefan Bernhart, Vice President of the European Chamber, and my colleague Ester Cañada Amela, Head of European Affairs at the European Chamber. The European Union elections are not as straightforward as individual countries. The process is unknown to many people. So first of all, let's kick off with some basics. Esther, could you introduce the general process of EU elections?
Sure. The EU elections are a 5-year process that leads to a general reshuffling within the European Union. First of all, we have the election of new members of the European Parliament and its leadership. But also member states elect the head of their own dialogue configuration, the European Council, and appoint and nominate the heads of the EU's executive body, the European Commission, and what could be construed as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the High Representative and Vice President. Now this year, the elections took place from 6th to 9th of June. So we now know the composition and leadership of the Parliament and who the head of the European Council will be. We also have a president-elect for the Commission, and we are, in addition, in the process of scrutinizing the members of the executive, the European Commission. So basically what we call the College of Commissioners.
When will the new government officially take office? It started from June. It's been a long time.
Ooh, well, that's a tricky question. Some people may think that European Union politics are not, very interesting, but this time there has been as much drama as we can expect from this process. The reason is the European Parliament needs to conduct hearing sessions where they evaluate the commissioners designate. And then they decide whether they approve or not these nominations, and then they vote on the College of Commissioners as a whole, including its president, which is Ursula von der Leyen. In this case, there have been some disagreements between the major political parties in the European Parliament that have taken some time to smooth out. But yesterday, they had one last push for discussion, and it seems that the election of the college as a whole may go through next week on the 27th of November. By the way, we are recording on the 21st of November. If that vote passes, then we would have a new commission starting from December the 1st.
Okay, let's focus on each of the EU institutions that went through the election process, starting from the Parliament. What are the roles of the Parliament?
So maybe just to take a step back and to provide a bit of an overview of how the European Union functions as a whole. The European Union is a supranational body. That means that it has been conferred a number of powers by the member states that are part of this group. So member states retain some power, and then the European Union has other, what we call competencies. The European Union functions in not so dissimilar a way as, a normal member state, a normal country. It has an executive branch, that is the European Commission. It has a bicameral legislative branch, that's the European Parliament and the Council of the EU. It has a central bank, and it has a judiciary branch. If we look at the European Parliament, as I mentioned, the Parliament is a co-legislator, so it develops and approves pieces of legislation. The European Parliament also elects a new commission, and the European Parliament discusses topics of interest in all types of areas, including foreign policy.
Stefan, why is the Parliament important for European players in China?
Well, first of all, I think that all three institutions are important for both our companies at home and also for the European businesses here in China, because they shape the regulatory framework basically of all industries. And when it comes to the relations with China, the European Union has its competency on trade for the entire union. They also shape the strategy of the EU with China. There are a number of regulations coming out of Brussels that go beyond the EU internal market. For example, the due diligence directive. So the European Parliament is one of the institutions and they are the legislator. So they are part of this rulemaking process and therefore important to watch also for us here on the ground.
Compared with the last parliament, what are the main differences this time around?
If we compare this European Parliament to the last one, which was elected in 2019, you will see that there is not such a huge difference in terms of who the hegemonic parties are, which are the center-right European People's Party and the Social Democrats, SD. So in this sense, there is relative stability within the European Parliament. What has changed is the parties that go after the EPP and SD. In 2019, we saw very good results from the Greens and the Liberals. To be honest, their performance in this election has been quite bad. Both parties have lost pretty big number of votes, and that has had implications not only in the composition of the parliament, but also in the member states. Who have been the relative winners in this case scenario? Well, that has been the hard-right parties, the European Conservatives and Reformists, and then a new party called Patriots for Europe, which is composed of the hard-right parties in different member states, for instance, Fidesz in Hungary, Vox in Spain, Lega in Italy. What kind of influence these hard-right parties will have within the parliament is still a question that we cannot answer at the moment. We have seen the hegemony parties create what we call a cordon sanitaire around the hard-right parties by, for instance, barring them from being in leadership positions for any of the committees in the European Parliament. But we're also starting to see some of the big parties voting together with the likes of Patriots of Europe. So again, that's a question mark.
You mentioned committees. What are the parliamentary committees?
The European Parliament works its way through different legislations with committees. So basically, if you have draft legislation that is environment or energy related, it will be discussed first in the configuration of energy or environment committees, and then it will be voted at the plenary.
Which committees are going to be the most relevant for European industry, particular company in China?
Well, I think for the European companies, both at home and in China, I think trade relations and foreign affairs are the two most important policy areas. And so the respective committees are most relevant for us. But it depends on the type of legislation that is dealt with in Brussels. So you have to watch sometimes also for other committees in the area of environment or also internal market when it affects relations with China.
Now let's move on to the European Commission. It's probably the first institution that comes to people's minds when they think about the European Union. So what roles does the European Commission play?
The European Commission is the equivalent of the executive arm of the government. It can propose legislation and it implements these legislation as well. It is headed by a president that has been Ursula von der Leyen for the past 5 years, and unless there is a dramatic development in the coming week, it will probably be Ursula von der Leyen for the next 5 years. And it is composed by a college of commissioners, which would be the equivalent of ministers in a country like China.
And what is the Commission's role vis-a-vis the bloc's engagement with China?
Well, the Commission's role in its engagement with China is to form the bilateral relationships between both blocs. There are a number of engagements like high-level economic dialogue, for example, or on other policy areas like digitalization. So these are important bilateral platforms that are key to the industry here on the ground.
Yeah, maybe just to complement, the European Commission is, for instance, in charge of negotiating trade deals and investment deals. As Stefan mentioned before, it has exclusive competence on trade. And so, for instance, in the case of China, it was the Commission, and in particular DigiTrade, that negotiated the now on the freezer comprehensive agreement on investment. But it is also the Commission that conducts investigation on trade defense, for instance, anti-dumping and anti-subsidies investigations, or investigations on access to procurement in third markets.
As you mentioned, Ursula von der Leyen was re-elected as president for another 5-year term. What are some of the policy continuities and the changes?
Well, I think it's first important to understand that Ursula von der Leyen, throughout this process, has been strengthened as the Commission president. So she will shape to a large degree the policy of the European Union from her perspective. I think the world today is a different one compared to 5 years ago. And that is reflected by the priorities that she and the Commission overall have set. You know, the 3 areas that are most crucial also for us here in China is that the Commission sees the need to strengthen the EU's competitiveness, that we have some challenges in our industrial base, in also trade imbalances. I think that is a focus area of the Commission now. The second one, I think, is more of a continuation, but also maybe a more focused approach on the green transition and decarbonization. And the third, I think, overall is security, regarding the defense of the European Union, but also, I think, economic security when it comes to de-risking approaches and the relationship with important trade partners. I think these are 3 important priorities of the Commission.
So how has these priorities impacting the dynamics in the EU-China relations?
Well, I think that the dynamics not necessarily shaped by the priorities, but the priorities are a result of certain developments. And I think first and foremost, I think we need to mention the Ukraine war, which has changed the EU's position, not only regarding its dependency on Russian oil and gas, but also the question of trade dependencies, has come to the forefront. The relations between China and Russia, have played out. That influences the way that Brussels sees China, and also the growing trade deficit between the EU and China is also an important factor in the priorities of the European Commission, because the approach of the Chinese leadership to strengthen the manufacturing sector and also the exports of manufactured goods is perceived as also a threat to the industrial base in Europe.
So the Commission is organized around different departments, and different departments have these commissioners. So which commissioners or departments are most relevant to the European companies that operate in China?
Maybe I should start by mentioning that the way a commission is structured and the College of Commissioners is structured can change across commissions. And in this case, the composition and the responsibility of the different commissioners reflect these evolving trends that Stefan has mentioned in his earlier points. So, for instance, if we look at trade, now the person in charge of the trade files is also in charge of economic security. And for instance, we have commissioners that are now in charge of the Mediterranean, of housing, which is quite a big issue in Europe. So again, the current structure of the Commission reflects the current challenges that Europe is facing. As Stefan has mentioned, this is a very strong commission with a von der Leyen at its core. If we look at the past College of Commissioners, we did not always have a full unity. We had diverging voices from some commissioners. This is no longer the case. So again, Ursula von der Leyen as president will be at the core of the new commission. In terms of which commissioners or ministers are relevant for us European companies in China, well, I mean, I have to say quite a lot. If you are looking into climate issues, you will want to focus on what the Commissioner for Climate is doing. If you're looking at competition, you'll want to look at the Executive Vice President for clean transition and competition. Again, it can vary depending on your interest. However, I would point at 3 major figures that will for sure be relevant to most, if not all, of our members here in China. The first one is Executive Vice President Stefan Bernhart. He will be in charge of industrial policy, and he will also oversee trade and the industrial clean transition. So, for instance, he will be the main counterpart to He Lifeng during the high-level economic and trade dialogue. Another key figure will be Maroš Šefčovič, who is set to be the Trade and Economic Security Commissioner. And that will include, for instance, WTO reform, trade agreements, trade relations with the US and China, and the implementation of trade defense instruments. The last one that I would mention is what in China would be the equivalent of the foreign minister, which in Europe is going to be Kaja Kallas. Again, I mean, she is the foreign minister, so she will look at relations with other countries, including in terms of security-related aspects such as disinformation and imposition of sanctions.
Let me add one aspect. I mean, if you listened a little bit to the hearings of these commissioners, when they were asked also about their position on certain policies regarding China, I think you can already see that the new commission has a much stronger position towards China. And I think the policy areas that Esther mentioned are exemplary of that. For example, I mean, Commissioner Šefčovič, I mean, when he was asked about economic security, I mean, he was talking about an economic security doctrine, which is meant to protect EU from subsidized goods. And it's quite obvious that he had China in mind. And also the Commissioner Kallas, who is responsible for foreign affairs, I mean, she talked about like China needs to feel the cost of their support for Russia. I think these are very, very strong positions that will inform the way that the Commission will behave going forward. Now, if that will change after the election of Trump, we will have to see. But I think we have to expect more tensions between the EU and China.
The last 2 institutions we're going to look at are the Council of the EU and the European Council. As you can see, their names are really confusing. So Esther, could you explain who are they? What's the difference?
Sure, and we are not going to go into the Council of Europe because that's also an institution and that exists, but we're not going to talk about that one. Basically, in a nutshell, the European Council and the Council of the EU are bodies that represent member states. The European Council is a configuration of heads of member states that meets regularly under the coordination and guidance of its president, which they elected in late June, and that's going to be Antonio Costa, the former Portuguese prime minister. And it has agenda setting and strategy setting powers. The European Council is also the body that, again, elects its own president, but also appoints the president of the Commission, subject, of course, to election by the European Parliament, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and the President of the Central Bank. Now, the Council of the EU is the other legislative body, so it has basically the same role as the European Parliament. And it is composed by members of the 27 member states, and it also has different configurations looking at specific pieces of legislation. For instance, it has Foreign Affairs Council, it has a Competitiveness Council, etc., etc. The Council of the EU functions under 6-month rotating presidencies that are held by different member states. So from July this year to December, the presidency is held by Hungary.
Has there been any changes to the internal dynamics of the Council in the 2024? If so, what are the drivers?
Well, overall, I think it's quite obvious that with 27 member states, you have sometimes diverging interests, and all member states have their own bilateral relations with China. So I think that is something that we need to take into account when we talk about Europe as a whole. And traditionally, it was France and Germany as the strongest economies to drive also the European policies. Now we have seen elections in the summer in France that has somewhat weakened the president's position. Now we have a situation in Germany where the coalition of 3 parties came to an end, which is, at least for some time, going to weaken the position of the German chancellor. That has weakened the position of the member states in general, I would say. But hopefully we will be able to overcome that soon, find more unity in the member states' position on important policy topics, including the relations with China.
If I may add then to Stefan's points, obviously, in any case where there are losers in a group, then that means that there are winners also. And what we have seen with the weakening of Germany and France's influence within the member states has been the rise of certain leaders in different countries. So we have seen a stronger Poland with Donald Tusk, who used to be the president of the European Council, so quite a European outlook. But we've also seen a strengthening of more hard-right leaders, such as Viktor Orban, who is heading Hungary, and Giorgia Meloni from Italy.
So we talked about the guidelines of the Commission earlier. So how has the Commission's guidelines, been received in the member states?
Well, similar to the Commission, the European Council also developed a strategic agenda for 2025-2029 back in June. And if you look at it, it's not so dissimilar to the Commission guidelines. And it basically focuses on 3 main pillars: preservation and defense of democracy, security, and competitiveness. And so what we see is that while broadly aligned on these priorities, the devil is really in the detail. Here we see a potential for divergence in terms of how member states approach the implementation of some of these broad guidelines. One example of this is the reception that basically one of the 2 reports underpinning the thinking on competitiveness in the EU, the Draghi report, which came out, I believe, in September. And again, this is a very detailed report. This is almost 400 pages, so still shorter than our position paper. But it's very granular in terms of actions that Europe needs to take in order to enhance its competitiveness in different areas, be it emerging technologies or energy security, and so on and so forth. One of the big questions in this report is the price tag and the role of the state in basically shouldering that pretty huge bill of 800 billion euros. So again, we will need to see how the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament move forward with pushing these reforms through.
From the industry perspective, I think it's worth mentioning that most of the analysis of the Draghi report was absolutely shared. In particular we are lacking in innovation regarding to the US and to China. that we need more public funding, especially in areas like R&D and infrastructure. I think these are like important elements, and also that like decarbonization and the green transition is a growth opportunity. I think that's also shared by most businesses.
And red tape, cutting off red tape.
That was my point that I was just wanted to make. I think that is a key element to reduce the burden of bureaucracy. I think this has been like a demand for years of the industry. I'm not sure whether we also need a department of government efficiency, but we don't have a great Elon Musk. So we have to count on the commissioners to really like mean it this time, when they say that they want to reduce bureaucracy, because that reduces the efficiency of the Commission, and it is a huge cost burden also for the European businesses, both at home and here in China.
Throughout 2024, there have been multiple engagements between individual member states and Chinese leaders. Are these exchanges useful, and do they have an impact on the EU's overall approach to China?
Well, I mean, on whether they're useful, I guess that we need to look at the individual exchanges. And trust me, there have been many. We as the European Chamber have had the privilege as well to be involved in some of the high-level, well, actually many of the high-level visits that have taken place here in China. I think that here, what we need to take into consideration is that while there is a basis for unity among member states, they each have their own interests. And one of the things that we have seen is that in certain points, the messages of individual leaders have not been necessarily fully aligned with the European message. For us as the European Chamber, that has been one of our key messages to EU stakeholders, be it Commission, be it Parliament, be it member states, and that is the need for unity and alignment vis-a-vis China.
As we are discussing the EU's overall strategic direction and approach to China, we also have to take into account other big players on the global stage. So Trump's re-election is going to bring major uncertainty to the international relations landscape. How do you see this impacting the EU's overall foreign policy, as well as its relation with China?
Well, the challenge with the uncertainty resulting from Trump's election is that it's hard to predict what he's going to do. But I think that it's both security and trade that will be the areas where Europe will be looking very carefully of what's going to happen. And in security, I mean, it's first and foremost like Trump's position towards NATO, and also his announcements or pledges to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. I think this is something that is of big concern in Europe. And when you look at China, I think China will play a crucial role to any kind of solution to the war in Ukraine. And as I said before, I mean, the relations of China between Russia, they play a major role there. Then when it comes to trade, I mean, Trump announced to raise 60% tariffs on everything coming out of China, and potentially 10 to 20% on products coming from anywhere, including Europe. So I think there is a common concern that the global trade system will be harmed dramatically. And at the same time, I think there is this concern of these trade imbalances between the EU and China. Everybody will look at their own interests, and there will be more protectionism as a result. I think this is the concern, certainly, of businesses in Europe and here in China.
China's actions, or sometimes inactions, have been a major driver of change in the EU's China policy. What could China do to improve the bilateral relationship?
I think when you talk about economic cooperation, one area what I already mentioned is the Ukraine war, and China's relations with Russia sort of like shrinks the space for that. So I think that is one important area. But then again, I mean, on the economic sphere itself, it's important that China acknowledges the concerns of Europe regarding the trade deficit, and also the concerns that we formulate as a European Chamber regarding the level playing field and market access and other topics. One important way is to take these concerns into consideration and to have a constructive dialogue to solve them.
Okay, to conclude, what are the key asks from European companies in China to the new EU leadership?
First and foremost, as European industry in China, we are invested in the relationship. We believe that China is a key market for many European companies, and so we want to preserve a relationship where we can not only survive but thrive in the market. Also, for Chinese companies in the EU, we want to preserve as much as possible the areas in the trade and investment relationship that are not necessarily controversial, and address as much as possible the issues in the relationship through dialogue. So my first point would be continue a constructive dialogue with China in areas of common interest, climate, cross-border data transfer, different sectors like financial services and others. We are living in a world that is very, very different from 2019 when the last commission took office. We understand that there needs to be an increasing focus on security and a reduction of dependencies. What we would ask is that the EU continue to take its current approach to, again, de-risking and to addressing security issues, whether it is traditional concept of security or economic security, which is a narrow and targeted approach. My next point would be, throughout the past 5 years, we have seen the EU develop a number of instruments that aim to ensure reciprocity, to address lack of level playing field and imbalances in the trading relationship. And we have seen as well the EU starting to use some of these tools. Here, what we would ask as European industry is that the EU takes an approach when thinking about potentially using certain instruments. They also consider the appropriateness vis-a-vis the industry that they are trying to support here by the application of these instruments to achieve the ultimate goal, like ensuring reciprocity or tackling distortions in the internal market or in the trading relationship. My last point, which basically underpins all of the others, would be for the EU to maintain regular consultation and exchanges with European industry. We are seeing some positive signs this year of EU strategy taking more into account the issues of European industry. For instance, the Draghi report was pretty much informed by feedback of European industry. And again, we see this as well in the von der Leyen guidelines regarding, for instance, cutting red tape and enhancing competitiveness and so on and so forth. This is the way for us to ensure that we preserve altogether European economic interests, both at home and in third countries like China.
So the Commission or the European Union as a whole has described its relations to China as partnership, cooperation, and rivalry. I think it is very important, despite all the political differences, that the EU does not forget to focus also on areas of cooperation. I think one important area is that the EU also tries to defend the global trade system, tries to find a way to keep the WTO as an organization alive, to push reform, possibly together with China. I think that would be an extremely important aspect. I think the other area, and I think we are very grateful here on the ground, is that the Commission also is very engaged with us in supporting us to improve the business environment here in China. We hope for a continued engagement between the EU and us, and between the EU and the Chinese leadership to continue that path.
The European Chamber has a decade-long tradition of annual visits to Brussels to present the position paper to senior EU representatives. These meetings have allowed the Chamber to ensure that its messages are heard and understood by influential European individuals in politics, businesses, media, and academia. The next EU tour will take place from 3rd to 7th February 2025. If you're a member of the European Chamber, make sure you attend working group meetings to stay informed and contribute to the Chamber's messaging for the tour. That's all for today. Thank you again, Stefan and Esther, for joining. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to China Dispatches, recommend it to your colleagues and friends, and share it on social media. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can find the contact details in the show notes. This is Gao Rui from China Dispatches. Thanks for listening.